surprise to me in that all of the places that are around the Durham area and the northeast, she was actually the most prolific serial killer before G.B. Harold Shipman. Her poison of choice was arsenic, because the symptoms of arsenic poisoning were very similar to gastrointestinal infection, which was like quite a prolific killer in the times that she was around. So it was less suspicious, and also you could just go out to your local chemist and you could buy arsenic, because it was used to kill bedbugs. I have notes again. I've been filling up my notepad with a few of these actually. Anyway, I am about to begin. If just a trigger warning, there's not a lot of details, but if you are if you don't want to hear a story about, or if you don't want to hear true crime about children being killed, I would suggest that you find a different video, as you'll see when I start. Mary Ann Cotton was a British serial killer. She's suspected to have murdered 21 people in the 19th century, and as I mentioned before, she was the most prolific British serial killer before G.B. Harold Shipman. And out of those 21 victims, I think it's 18 of them were actually her own children. Mary Ann Cotton was born Mary Ann Robson in 1832 in the village of Low Mosley, just outside Hetonley Hall in Sunderland, Tyne and Wear. Not long after her birth, her family moved to East Drayton in County Durham. They moved again when Mary was 8 to the village of Merton. Soon after they moved, Mary Ann's father fell to his death at Merton Colliery. Her mother quickly remarried a man named George Stott, whom Mary Ann didn't get along with. She left home aged 16 to become a nurse, and there was also some rumours around the town of Merton that she may have pushed a boyfriend down the mine shaft in her early teens, killing him. After leaving home, Mary Ann met a man named William Mowbray, whom she married on the 18th of July 1852 when she was aged 20. The couple moved down to the West Country shortly after that. They lived there for 3 years before moving back to Merton, but they did not return alone, as Mary Ann returned with a daughter who was also called Mary Ann. It's speculated that she had 3 or maybe 4 children in the West Country who had all died in infancy. This wasn't considered odd or suspicious, as Victorian times the infant mortality rate was very high. The next part of the story, some of the names do get confusing because there's lots of duplicates, but hopefully you can follow along. On the 5th of April 1857, Mary Ann had a child in the northeast who she named Margaret Jane Mowbray. She died soon after her birth, and in September 1858 she gave birth again to a girl named Isabel. Then on June the 24th, 1860, Mary Ann Mowbray, the daughter, not the one who became Mary Ann Cotton, the couple had brought back with them from Cornwall, died of a gastric fever. The next year, on October the 1st, she had another daughter whom she also named Margaret Jane, and then in the November of 1863 she had a son named John Robert, and it was at this point the family moved to Sunderland, and their son John Robert died soon after they moved. So she had 2 children who she named Margaret Jane Mowbray. One died, and at this point one is still alive. William was at the time working as a colliery foreman until he was injured at work, forcing Mary to be his carer and nurse. Suddenly he developed a gastric fever and died. Mary had his life insured through the Prudential Insurance Company and received a payout of £35, which is the equivalent of about £2,069 in today's money, and she also received a payout of £2, which is about £133.04 for John. Mary moved to Seaham Harbour in Durham. Shortly before, or maybe after, Margaret Jane died of a gastric fever, leaving her with just 1 child out of the 9 she had, and the 1 child that was left was Isabel. Isabel, her last surviving child, was sent to live with Mary Ann's mother, who was called Margaret. At this time, Mary Ann soon began an affair with a man named Joseph Nattrass, but he left her to marry another woman. Mary Ann took a job on the fever ward at this time of Sunderland Infirmary, where she met husband number 2, who was named John Ward. He was a patient of hers, and when he was discharged, they got married on August 28th, 1865. Mary had hoped that the marriage would improve her social standing, as George would as an engineer, but Ward's ill health prevented him from working. He developed a fever and died in October 1866, and Mary Ann had his life insured and she collected the insurance money. After George's death, Mary Ann took a job as a housekeeper for a widower with 5 children by the name of James Robinson. She lived in his house, which was located in a town called Pallion, which is in Sunderland, a month after her arrival. James's youngest son, who was called John, died of a gastric fever. James sought comfort in Mary Ann, and soon Mary Ann was pregnant with his child. At this time, Mary Ann's mother began suffering with hepatitis, so asked for Isabel to be returned to her mother. Mary Ann returned back to Merton to nurse her mother, but within 9 days she died, and Mary Ann stripped the house of all of the belongings. Mary Ann then returned to Robinson, hoping to marry him with Isabel in tow. But within 10 days there were 3 more deaths in the Robinson household. James Robinson Jr., Elizabeth Robinson and Isabel all died of a gastric fever. After this, Mary apparently became ill and depressed. There's some speculation that perhaps Isabel's death was an accident, or she'd given herself a mild dose of the poison and Isabel was meant to have a mild dose as well, to kind of divert suspicion from her, but unfortunately Isabel got too much and died. She'd given herself a mild dose of the poisoning, as James's sisters were growing suspicious of this woman who had just moved into their house, and suddenly the children were dying. And in spite of his sister's disapproval, Mary Ann and James were married at Bishop Wearmouth on August the 11th, 1867. Mary Ann gave birth to another daughter, Mary Isabel, but within a month the child was dead, making this the 5th child to die at the Robinson house. They had a got custody of George, and Mary never returned to the house. This son and the husband, James, were the only ones who survived Mary Ann Cotton. In 1870, Mary Ann met Frederick Cotton and became his housekeeper. Mary had been friends with his sister Margaret. Fred, like James, was a widower at the time they met, and Mary Ann moved in with him. With him, Margaret and his two children, Frederick Jr. and Charles, to their house in North Warburton. Now, the wife that was dead, that made Fred a widower, there was no suspicion about Mary Ann's involvement at this point, and the timelines after this point, I was looking at a couple of resources, and some of them have slightly different timelines for some of the deaths. I went with the one that was from the Oxford National Archives, because I figured maybe that's the most accurate, but I know that. So if you do know about this case and you've heard a slightly different timeline, that might be why, I guess, because the records weren't kept in the same way. There's maybe some discrepancy. Anyway, where were we? By the April of 1870, Margaret and the youngest of the Cotton children were dead. Like she had with James, Mary Ann consoled Frederick and soon became pregnant. The two bigamously, she was still married to James Robinson, married on September the 17th, 1870. The family then moved to Johnson Terrace, which is in West Auckland, after neighbours accused Mary Ann of poisoning their pigs. It's thought that Mary Ann was insistent on this address, as Mary's former lover, Joseph Nattrass, lived on the same street. Mary gave birth to another son, named Robert Robson Cotton. Frederick wouldn't take out a life insurance policy, the life insurance policy that Mary had hoped for, but regardless, by September of 1871, Frederick and Robert were also dead. Sympathetic neighbours provided Mary Ann with money, and she was even given free coal from the local colliery. 3 months after Fred's death, Mary Ann's former lover, himself now a widower again, Mary Ann wasn't suspected in Joseph Nattrass's wife's death. It was just natural causes. Moved in as her lodger and made a will in her favour. Mary began working as a nursemaid for an excise man called John Quick Manning, though there is some speculation around his name. It may have actually been Robert Quick Manning or Robert Quick Man, based on the employment records, because there wasn't actually a record of a John Quick Manning who worked at the brewery in West Auckland. After Joseph Nattrass died of a gastric fever, Mary quickly became pregnant with Mr. Quick Manning's child. Nattrass left Mary just £10, which is about £591, and a watch. John Quick Manning had no interest in staying around to marry Mary or to look after the child, and so he fled. There's some reports that he had a fiancée who lived in Darlington, and he went back to the fiancée. Others say that he fled abroad, perhaps. Mary Ann was left alone, pregnant, and still looking after Charles Cotton, who was Frederick Cotton's last remaining child. At this point, Mary Ann was on poor relief, so tried to have the child placed with an uncle. When this didn't work, she organised for him to be sent to a workhouse. The master of the workhouse became suspicious after he told Mary that she would have to go with Charles to live in the workhouse as well, and she replied that Charles would choking for 3 minutes before her death. A point I didn't really mention earlier in the story is why didn't all the insurance policies were through the Prudential Insurance Company, and why didn't they grow suspicious of all these policies being taken out by one person and then these people are suddenly dying? Basically, she wasn't discovered due to the fact that her name was always changing through marriage and she was constantly moving from place to place, so it never flagged to them that these were the same person that had all these policies. So that was why she was never caught